Okay, in this video, we're going to start discussing transport units and passengers. Now, when I talk about transport units, that's going to be any unit with a movement factor that is either green or blue-green, like this M113 located right here. Now, to save myself repeating myself over the course of this next couple of videos talking about transport, do keep in mind that the act of loading or unloading does trigger the opportunity fire for the enemy. So that's going to count every time as we discuss all the different types of loading and unloading throughout these videos. So a transport unit like this M113, it can be loaded with a unit that is using a support weapon and an HQ counter. So you can have up to 3 counters under this transport unit under the right circumstances. Once a unit is loaded into a transport, though, they are no longer acting individually, so they can't perform fire or move around on their own. They're considered inside of this transport. Also, they're not going to count against the stacking limit. So let's say this infantry is in this transport. This tank could also be in the same hex as well, and this wouldn't violate stacking limits. But if all 3 of these units were in the same hex without them being transported, then yes, that would violate the stacking limit. As usual, just about every other rule in the game, if the unit's disrupted, it can't perform certain things. So say, for example, these infantry were disrupted, they would not be able to load into this transport. But there are times when a unit can be disrupted that is already being transported by a vehicle due to combat results, and we'll get into that more specifically later on. Something else you need to remember is that a unit does not have the ability to load and unload in a single activation. You can only do one or the other. So when it comes to loading, there's a couple of different ways to do it. If a unit starts in the same hex, so if our transport unit and our passengers here start in the same hex, then they can take and perform a load action and put the passenger counter underneath the transport to signify that they are being transported. And at that point, the transport could use up to 1/2 of its movement points rounded down and then be marked ops complete. So as our example here, the M113, had they loaded these passengers, would have 3 movement points to spend if they wish to do so. So the other way to do it is if they move together, but there are some limitations to that. So say our passengers, our infantry here, want to get loaded up into this M113. The way it works is the transport can move up to 1/2 of its movement points, and the passengers, the infantry, can move up to 1 movement point as long as they end up in the same hex and then perform the load action. So since their movement point value is a 6, they could move 3 movement points. They could go 1, 2. Let's pretend this is not a city and just a clear terrain hex for our example here. So 3, and then these infantry could move 1 movement point, again, pretending the city's not there just for our example, and they could perform a load action at that point, and then obviously be marked ops complete. So 1 movement point for the passengers and 1/2 rounded down for the transport as long as they end up in the same hex. Then they can perform their load action, be marked ops complete. And again, remember, all movement is subjectable to opportunity fire. One last thing, obviously towed units would not be able to load in this way since a towed unit cannot move on its own.